first off, I want to acknowledge that what I'm presenting to you right now is actually an amalgamation with some thoughts of my own, but actually reflects the work of some really important thinkers in the field. Jerry Mackey, who is at the University of California at San Diego, Francesca Monetti, who is at UNICEF, Cristina Bicchieri, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. They have been working on this for a while and have been working together and do a social norms course, which I have learned a lot from. And so a lot of what I'm presenting to you is actually my effort to take their work and translate it into something that I could understand. So just to credit them up front. So yesterday, if you recall, when I put up that chart about the informal, formal, and structural versus or structural to individual, the point of that, when we were looking at quadrants, is just that all of these problems, these sticky problems that we're dealing with, have interlocking causes, right? So they have structural factors, they have social factors, and then they have individual factors. And this is just sort of another way of conceptualizing the socio-ecological model that we were talking about yesterday. But the reason I wanted to put this up is because I'm going to be talking today about that cog, the social cog. But another key one, especially with respect to sexual exploitation in my view, is the structural factors. And the structural factors are actually the things that define what we call sort of people's choice sets. I mean, so some people make choice, they have agency, they're choosing things, but it's within a constrained set of options because of economic factors, because of gender regimes or expectations, because of religious ideologies. So all of these things are the things that are incredibly important. And so any intervention, I just want to sort of re-emphasize, any intervention is going to have to deal not just with the social realm, but the things that structure that social realm. And fundamentally, these are things about power, right? And these are the things that really go to the core of the issue. We tend to focus a lot on that individual realm, and yet I think what we really need to be focusing on in terms of prevention are the social and structural factors. So when I talk about structural factors, I'm talking about that idea of going upstream. So our parable from yesterday, right? So this is the things like lack of livelihood or secure livelihoods. They're inequalities that are actually structured into our societies via things like inheritance law, our property rights, who inherits, who doesn't, who has access to property, who doesn't, who has access to job. You all know how gendered all of those things are. So there's differences between men and women. We also have global forces that are now influencing and filtering down even more than in the past, right? So we have rising consumer cultures that coexist with increasing inequalities in our countries and in many settings. So you have this almost clash where people are now aware, far more than they ever have been in the past, of the things that are out there as possibilities that they can't access. We also have the rise of criminal syndicates and many of you who have worked with trafficking. I mean, all of these things are structural factors. Okay, but with what I want to try to do today is sort of unpack this little social cog here. Because within the social cog, we have a lot of things going on. We have beliefs, we have social norms, we have attitudes, we have values, and we use these terms, at least in the world that I work in, which is violence against women, we use these terms sort of interchangeably. Everything's a gender norm. We don't really make very clear theoretical distinctions between these concepts. And I think that that's been a problem. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is ask ourselves if we can become clearer about the distinctions between attitudes and norms and social beliefs versus non-social beliefs, values, those types of things. Can that actually help us improve our programming? So it's a hypothesis, and this is what we've been working with over the last few years. So just to give some distinctions, and there are different definitions for these things, but for the purposes of our discussion, I'm going to offer you a few. So an attitude, all right, is an individual judgment that has an evaluative component. So it's something like, 11-year-olds shouldn't be allowed to ride the bus alone. That's my opinion. I'm evaluating as either good or bad. It has this kind of judgment quality to it. So it's a belief that has a judgment quality. Another one, smartphones are cool. I don't even know what kids would say today. I'm sure it's not cool, but something like that. It's okay for a husband to hit his wife, but only if she's done something wrong. So these are individual belief systems that have an evaluative component. Behavior, obviously, is what someone actually does, right? So oftentimes what we're trying to do is we're trying to change behavior. And we can do that in a number of ways, but we have to understand, we have to have a theory underneath about what motivates behavior and what changes behavior. And there's multiple different theories out there. But I'm just going to give you a few concepts that I think are important for us to think about. So obviously, we have the structural factors, right, that we were talking about. These are kind of material things and forces that define the choice set that I have as an individual. So if I live in, what are my opportunities? They're different if I'm poor than if I'm rich. There's also incentives. So we're all respond to incentives. Someone offers me more money. Do I go to that job versus the job that I have? Then there's intrinsic motivations, right? So these are things where they're actually more psychological. My aspirations. What are my hopes for life? I'm also making cognitive judgments, right, about risk and benefits or the cost of something. And then we also have a set of beliefs. And I'm making a distinction here between what I call social beliefs, which we're going to talk about in a second, and non-social beliefs. So non-social beliefs are basically factual beliefs. They're things about the material world. So, and they can be true or false. I may believe that, the Earth goes around the sun, or I may believe that the sun goes around the Earth. I mean, one of them is true, but it doesn't matter. That's my belief. But it's about the physical world. The social beliefs are my expectations and beliefs about how I relate to others. So that's the distinction there, and we'll play with that a little bit further on. And then we have social motivations, right? So all human beings have really deep-seated needs and capacities for empathy, for the need to belong to groups. I mean, one of the strongest things that you see cross-culturally is that everyone has a very deep-seated need to belong. And a lot of social norms work by virtue of playing off of the fact that people want to belong. And if they depart, if they do something different than what their group expects of them, they may lose that sense of belonging or place. So what is a norm? Okay, and there's many different disciplinary histories and economics has discussions and language about norms, social psychology does, sociology does, Marxism does. I mean, so there's a long history of this. So I'm offering to you one way to think about it. And in this way, I think, again, norms are essentially social, all right? It has to do with your relationship with others. So one of the problems with this is that the word norm in English has lots of different uses, right? So sometimes we talk about the norm as just being the average. So if we talk about the average number of rooms per household in Dakar, that's the norm. Sometimes we talk about it in the way that I'm using it today, which is a social norm. So what people in a group believe to be both typical and appropriate. Okay, so what I should do. And then we also have moral norms. And the distinction between a social norm and a moral norm is a moral norm actually is one that you feel obliged to follow regardless of what other people do. So if I'm, for example, Jewish and I believe that I should wear a yarmulke, I don't expect you to wear a yarmulke if you are Muslim. And if you told me, well, that's stupid to wear a yarmulke, I would still do it because it comes out of a sense of morality. It's not necessarily defined or motivated by, it is, let me go back. It has social elements to it. So if you would not wear a yarmulke and every one of your Jewish friends in church does, not in church, in temple, so shows you I'm not Jewish. Anyway, then you might, it might also be a norm. But the idea is that sometimes there's something that appeals to even a higher notion than the belief system of your group. So if we look at sort of social norms, if we want to take a very simple definition, we can say it's a set of social expectations shared within a valued reference group. All right? And so the notion of a reference group is a really important concept to think about. So the reference groups are the relevant people, the relevant others who for that issue are important to you. So one of the things to realize is that for different behaviors, there may be different reference groups. So if you're an adolescent trying to decide whether to try drugs or to try cigarettes or something, your most important reference group might well be your peers. Whereas for some other behavior, even that same adolescent might be looking to the approval and looking to wanting to maintain acceptance by a different set of people. So different behaviors, even for the same person, can have different reference groups. And the third element of making something a norm versus some other type of belief is that it's maintained by what we call social influence. So it means that there's a consequence if you depart from it, right? So if it's a norm, then it means that if I stop doing it and my referenced others, my reference group believes that I should be doing it, I might be subject to gossip, or I might be subject to sanction, or they won't want to play with me anymore if I'm a child, or whatever. So there's often a consequence, and they can either the draw to conform to a norm can either be positive or negative. So sometimes you want to comply with the norm because it gives you approval and there's positive things that come from it. Sometimes you comply because you know that if you don't comply, there'll be negative sanctions. So there's two kinds of norms that social psychologists recognize. And there's different language for these, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to use the language of descriptive versus injunctive. Okay? So a descriptive norm is actually what do other people or what do I think other people do? All right, so if I am a teenager on a college campus in the United States, what percentage of my friends do I think drink? Okay, that would be a descriptive norm. It may not be correct, it may be factually incorrect, but it's my perception about what is the behavior of others. An injunctive norm is the one that has the evaluative component to it. So it's what I think others believe should be done, or that especially what I should do. And so it's injunctive norms are crucial as they distinguish social norms for other practices. So that's the thing where if, I may have I may have a set of beliefs, and they may be factual or not. And another thing is that the descriptive and the injunctive expectations usually align, but they don't always. All right? So, for example, I'll give you an example. It may be that if you ask people in a country where corruption or bribing is really common, people may say, well, I think that, my expectation is that you shouldn't do that. But everybody does. And so the draw of a descriptive norm can actually override, oftentimes, the injunctive norm. So if something is really common, despite the sense that it may not fit the expectations, people do it. So that's why you see, people will say, well, if, I would pay my taxes, but since nobody else is paying their taxes, why the hell should I pay my taxes? That's that kind of behavior, right? So I think one of the key things in terms of programming is actually trying to diagnose and figure out whether something that you're encountering in your program or your social world really is a norm or if it's something else, okay? And we'll talk in a second about why that's important. So, for example, not all things that people do are norms. So, for example, wearing a coat outside when it's cold. Now, almost everybody does that. But if you didn't, the question is, would there be any consequence? Would your friends think less of you? Your mom might. But, so the question is this something where there would be a consequence of in a reference group that's important to you, so that that would lead you to want to conform, even if your preference, your individual preference, would be different. So another one might be the use of children in pornography. That's closer to home. And the question is, it's conceivable that that could be a norm if you were a group of, let's say, pedophiles who were closely aligned and you had certain sort of expectations amongst yourself, and if someone departed, that you would no longer be able to be part of that group. But if that's not the case, then it's driven for something else. It might be an individual motivation. It might be something biological. It could be an individual preference. And so you have to do this sort of diagnosis. So the key question for the diagnosis, I don't know if you can see that, is the behavior driven by beliefs about what others do, so what you think others do, and what they expect you to do? And would you still act the same way even if others disagree? And are there consequences from departing from it? So, we can look at some of these, and again, they may be norms in one setting and for one set of group of people and not for another. So if we just, off the top of our heads, if we thought about child marriage it doesn't have to be Afghanistan, pick a place that you know. would you think that if someone wants to offer a reflection about whether or not they think that's a norm in their setting? Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about it in countries where it contradicts the general norm. So in the UK, for instance, child marriage, if we think within this room, child marriage is not the norm, depending on which reference group we look at,
right.
Even in the UK, it could be the norm.
Right. So what you're saying is, within kind of the broad UK culture, it's not a norm. But maybe that a particular family living in the UK is less influenced. Their important reference group is not like generic UK English people. It's more their extended family and what is going to be expected of them. Or their, so that's why getting clear on who the reference group is becomes quite important, right? Other thoughts about the child marriage example?
I would say in the UK, couldn't you also argue that avoiding child marriage has become a norm? So you still have a fair number of young people who have children at an age where the norm would have been for them to then get married. And now that would be an anomaly, and people would disapprove. Why are you suggesting your 16-year-old should get married just because she's had a baby? So I would say, if anything, there's a norm against getting married.
Early marriage, despite other
behaviors that are used to be linked to marriage.
Right.
Continually.
And that's a really good example too, because it shows how these things shift over time, right? So in my mother's generation, if she had gotten pregnant at 16, she would have gotten married. My father, or her father would have made sure she got married. Whereas today, no, probably not. I mean, it depends on the setting and everything. So these things shift over time. So I think the reason that this becomes important is because if a norm is operative, then the behavior is unlikely to change without addressing the norm. So the best way, or a way, to think about norms is that they can be brakes on social change. And so, for example, because what happens is, if something is just driven by a belief or an attitude, I can engage with that person individually and potentially change their mind or provide new information or whatever that would change their attitude or their belief. But or another example is I can empower a young girl. I can do an empowerment program for a young girl. But if she's embedded in a system where the norm is still very strong, then even though she may want to do something different, the cost to her may be too high. And so it may not be enough to see social change if we only work with the young girl. We have to work with her family or whoever the reference group is. So it really is important for directing us toward who do we need to be working with in order to see shifts over time. But it's important to recognize that not all behaviors are driven by norms. So sometimes it's absolutely fine to just work one-on-one. And that's why that diagnosis becomes important. So another important point to think about is that norms don't really stand alone. And we've already talked about the importance of structural factors, but they're also embedded in sort of webs of interconnected beliefs, values, and other norms and expectations, right? And as we said before, that behaviors can have a material basis too, meaning like they could be born in poverty or the needs of insecure livelihoods. So what this is it's just showing that oftentimes what you have is almost a lattice where you have a set of beliefs that are not norms, but a set of factual beliefs, some of which may be not correct, that interlock with certain norms which interlock with, that form attitudes. And that also, there's other supporting norms. So sometimes the behavior that we're looking at, or the phenomena, the problem itself is not a norm, but there's important norms that are helping sustain it. And so let me give you an example using IPV, partner violence. So here we have, in some places, partner violence could be a norm. It could be that a man is expected to discipline his wife, and if he doesn't, that other people will look down on him because, what kind of man are you, and you're not controlling your woman. And so there are places like that. Other places, it's really, partner violence itself is not a norm. I mean, there's no cost if you don't beat your wife, but the problem of partner violence is held in place by other norms and beliefs. So, for example, the factual belief, that women will not obey unless beaten, or children won't obey unless beaten, or the way that you create a moral child is that you beat them, and that women need discipline to be a good wife. Now that is a belief, it's not a norm, but it fits in with the whole system that's holding partner violence in place. There's also positive attitudes, that people have attitudes towards the practice. So hitting is an acceptable form of discipline, right? So there's normative expectations. So these are starting to get into norms, that other men will look down upon a man who can't keep his wife in line. So this is a masculinity norm that's helping to hold in place the behavior. But then there's also other norms. So the norms of keeping family together is more important than a woman's well-being, or disclosing violence will bring shame upon the family. Those are things where if you talk about problems in the family, there will be a consequence, right? That is a norm. That is being held in place by expectations, and yet it's not directly a norm on violence, but you can see how it fits into the things that are holding it in place. Then there's also this idea of schema and scripts. And this is I don't want to go in deeply into this, but this actually comes out of cognitive science. And it's sort of how your brain lays down memories. Your brain is associative, right? So one of the things that happens is we couldn't possibly live life if we had to make individual decisions about absolutely everything. So what happens is we develop habits. We know, brushing your teeth, it involves picking up the toothbrush, taking off the cap, doing it, and you can almost do it without even thinking about it. Sometimes I take pills in the morning and think, did I take those pills? I can't even remember, because you just kind of go into this mode. And that's, and so we have certain scripts too. I'm a student. What do? I sit down, I get my books out, I get ready for class. And these are things that are patterned over time, and they become sort of almost like ruts, and so we have scripts about what is it to be a good wife, or what is it to be a good man. And so every time something reminds you of that, then you have these scripts that are these ready-made responses. So an example of schema is these are these deeply embedded cognitive structures, right? So if you think about the ones that are driving violence, gender is probably the biggest, at least for partner violence, and it's one of the hardest to undo, because if you think about it, almost everything in life is gendered. You from the time you're a little kid, from the moment you were born, you're getting messages that are creating associations in your mind about what it is to be a girl or what it is to be a boy. And those are played out in the job setting and in the household setting, and it's just reinforced over and over and over again. Whereas a script about how do you play tennis or something like that, a scheme about that, you may do that, once every 2 months or something. So it's really deeply ingrained. Another one, I think, that you see is this notion of ownership. So we have this idea of what ownership means, right? It means if you own something, you control it. You can sell it, you can break it, you can do all of these different things to it. So when something triggers the scheme of ownership, like if people who think about their children as owning their children, or owning their wife, or you have a system of lobola or bride price where there's actual payment exchange, which feeds in and triggers all of these associations that pre-exist about what it means to own someone. That also feeds in to the justification and the behavior. And you see that in a lot of things about purity, about violated women being unpure, ruined. If she's been raped, then she's been ruined in some way. And honor, a lot of the honor culture ideas. So that's a lot of information, but just to do a really short idea about how this might apply to programming, is a couple things. Is one, if you're going to try to deconstruct a social norm, then you have to really focus on people's social expectations within the right reference group, right? So you can't just deal with the person that has the behavior. You've got to deal with the people that they're responding to. And I think that it's often easier, and this is a really important point, it's often easier to create a new positive norm, a new alternative, a new script, a new set of associations, than to dismantle an existing problematic one. So, this idea, you saw it even in some of your programs, the idea of rather than dismantling the idea of truck drivers sleeping with young girls, they said, we're going to create a new norm expectation of truck drivers as protectors, as something positive. So that's something to play with, because the positive is actually often easier than undoing this decades-long associations that already exist. So basically, shifting norms requires, as we said before, 3 things. Is people have to have an appropriate assessment, or 3 areas that you can intervene on. One is what people have to have an appropriate or accurate, not appropriate, idea of what people think others do. So oftentimes, and you see this, for example, for years in the contraceptive literature, where women thought that men were less supportive of their using contraception than they actually were. Like the men had started to change, but the women actually hadn't realized that the men had started to change. We see that with justifications for partner violence. The data show that now the rates of men saying that it's acceptable to hit your wife under certain things are actually lower than women saying it, which is again probably that they just haven't realized that things have started to change. So one opportunity is to actually give accurate information to people and to visibilize the change, right? So that people know that people are changing. Then you need to actually deal with the injunctive piece about what people think others believe they should do, and be really clear about this reference group. Who are these people? And what is it that people fear? Is it gossip? Is it what is the sanction? So I think one of the most important things for programming is who we work with. I mean, so for example, if we were trying to look at child marriage, oftentimes what we do is we work with adolescent girls, and we'll do an empowerment program or whatever. Very important. It's not that that's not important, but actually the norm and the people who are holding the belief system and the expectations that would keep her from even being able to act on it, even if she changed her mind, might well be somebody else, the bridegroom's family, or the parents, or even the village. So they might be highly motivated to change, but really not be able to. And sometimes, I mean, our empowerment programs, not everyone is as influenced by norms. So you'll see people, and these are like the cutting edge people of social change. You'll see people who will say, I don't care what other people think. I'm going to do it anyway. And so empowerment programs can create some of those frontline vanguard kind of people who are strong enough in themselves and their own beliefs that they're less influenced by norms. But the average people are very influenced by these things. The costs are high. Another thing that we've learned is that descriptive norms, emphasizing with programming, descriptive norms can actually backfire. So this is this 1 and 3 thing. Part of the problem is that in a lot of parts of the world, far less women than 1 and 3 actually are victimized. But if you create this and everyone sees this, it actually can communicate to men that it's more common, that more of their other people are doing it than they even think. And so you have to be careful about some of these messages, because they might be great sort of campaigning messages, but what are you communicating? Another one, this is an example of a thing of rape and war. And, and a lot of times people kind of the campaigning part of us want to talk about how big the problem is. But actually, that may communicate to people out in the world that it's actually, well, everybody's doing it, right? So why shouldn't I? And there's actual experimental and research evidence showing that this happens. So this is an example, again, these are partner violence examples, but about how to emphasize positive descriptive norms. So 74% of college men, this is the US, 74% of college men would intervene to prevent a sexual assault, right? So, or I listen when a girl says no, do you? So that's the opposite, right? It also, you can do things by reshaping definitions and expectations. So oftentimes you'll hear, well, this is just our culture, right? So this is a group now that's actually trying to directly counter that, saying, well, this isn't our culture, and trying to create a more positive alternative.